Welcome back to Cross to Cross Conversations. This is Monica and I am your host. We are continuing with our Black History series. I have this one and then two more to do before I wrap it up. I didn't mean to have so many days pass between the last one and this one. However, with all of the reading and studying and trying to put things in here because there is a desired end that I'm getting to, I tend to add more and more. And then I had to realize that I can't literally put everything in these episodes. I'm hoping that this series will prompt further thought, the desire to want to dig in to study more. But more importantly, I am hoping that it brings about conversation. This episode discusses extreme racial violence, mass murder, terrorism, and destruction of entire black communities. This content is disturbing and graphic. If you need to pause or skip this one, I certainly understand. Your mental health and self care are important. In the last episode, we talked about the foundation from the years 1619 to 1877. We talked about slavery as America's true founding in 1619. We discussed the year 1718, where New Orleans were founded. We talked about the codes they enacted. We talked about slavery's infrastructure expanding into the Deep South. We talked about Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, and that was the Supreme Court ruling that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. We talked about the 13th Amendment and its loophole, except as punishment for crime. We talked about Reconstruction, that brief 12-year period where black people had real political power. When black men voted, they held office, they built schools, and they also bought land. And we talked about the Compromise of 1877, when the federal government withdrew troops and basically abandoned black people to white supremacist violence. And that's where we left off. 1877, the term redemption, and the beginning of Jim Crow. But before we talk about Jim Crow as a legal system, which will take place in the next episode, we need to talk about how it was enforced. Because Jim Crow wasn't just laws on paper. Jim Crow was actually enforced through terror. And so today we're talking about 6 massacres that most Americans may have never heard. Some of them for sure you've heard of. 6 times when white mobs murdered black people, destroy entire communities, and face zero consequences. So these aren't isolated incidents. You're going to see it's a pattern. And I need to say this clearly before we begin. I'm not telling you these stories to make you feel guilty if you're white or to make you feel hopeless if you're black. I'm telling you these stories because they happened. It's history. And it's what happens that shapes what's happening now. So remember, truth is the first step towards healing. So we're going to talk about the Colfax Massacre from 1873. We talked the last episode about Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War when black men could vote, when black men could be elected to office, and when there was real political power for the first time. In Louisiana, black people were the majority of the population, and that meant in a real democracy, black people would control the government. But white supremacists, they couldn't accept that. And so what happened was on April 13th of 1873 in Colfax, Louisiana, there was a disputed election for governor. The Republican government said they won, and the Democratic government said they won. So in Colfax, which was a small town in central Louisiana, black men, many of them were Union Army veterans, they occupied the courthouse to protect it and ensure the Republican officials could take office. They had every legal right to be there. They were defending democracy. But on that day, on April 13th, the white militia, and it was estimated to be about 300 to 500 men, They attacked. They had cannons, they had rifles, they were organized and armed. And the black defenders, they fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. So when the white militia breached the courthouse, black men surrendered. They laid down their weapons and they raised their hands. And then what happened? They were executed anyway. Some were shot in the back while kneeling. Some were stabbed with bayonets. Some were burned alive inside the courthouse. And it is stated that over 150 black men were killed. Most of these black men that were killed, it was after they surrendered, after they had put their hands up to say they surrendered. In the aftermath of that, there was basically no justice. 3 white men were eventually charged under the Enforcement Act, which was a federal law designed to protect black civil rights. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was called, the case is United States versus Cruikshank in 1876. The Supreme Court threw out the charges. The court ruled that the 14th Amendment only prohibited state discrimination, not private acts of violence. So, in other words, what were they saying? That the federal government couldn't protect black people from white mobs. So this decision, it actually gutted the Reconstruction. It gave legal permission for basically white terrorism. No one was ever held accountable for that massacre. And then a century later, there was a historical marker in Colfax that called it the Colfax Riot and said it marked the end of carpetbag misrule. Carpetbag misrule, from what I understand, is what they called black people voting. And that stood in place until 2008. So Colfax was in 1873, just 8 years after slavery ended. And the next massacre I'm going to tell you about happened in 1898, so 25 years later. By this time, redemption was in full swing. White supremacists were violently retaking control of the South. And in Wilmington, North Carolina, they didn't just kill black people, they actually overthrew the government. And so in 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina, it was considered a thriving economy. It was majority black. It had a biracial, if you call, city government, a fusion of Republicans and populists. Black people owned businesses. There were black lawyers, black doctors, black professionals, black property owners. The Daily Record was a black-owned newspaper edited by Alex Manley. And what that newspaper did, the Daily Record, it actually challenged some of the lies that were being told by the white supremacists. So Wilmington was proof that when black people had opportunity, they built wealth and power. And again, the white Democrats couldn't tolerate that. So this wasn't a spontaneous riot. This was a planned coup. White supremacist leaders, so businessmen, politicians, former Confederate officers, they coordinated this for a month. This was a planned attack. They ran a propaganda campaign in white newspapers, stoking fear of Negro domination. They organized white militias, stockpiled weapons, and rehearsed. And what was their plan? Their plan was to intimidate black voters, to steal the election, and if necessary, use violence to take control. So the election day was November 8th of 1898, and the white supremacists stationed armed men at polling places in black neighborhoods. They threatened black men, basically telling them, vote Democrat or die. And many black men stayed home. Others were turned away at gunpoint, and the Democrats won. But I guess that wasn't enough. And so on November 10th, 1898, 2 days after the election, a white mob of estimated 2,000 plus armed men, was what I read, marched on the Daily Record building. And so they smashed the printing press, they poured kerosene, they burned it all to the ground. And then they went hunting. They went through black neighborhoods, shooting anyone they saw. And the estimates, from what I was able to read, it was estimated that From 60 to 300 black people were killed. So there were some bodies that were dumped in the Cape Fear River. Some were burned in unmarked graves. And the exact number, of course, will never be known because white authorities destroyed records and silenced the witnesses. And so the mob then marched to City Hall. They had their weapons drawn and they forced the mayor, the police chief, and the city council to resign. They installed a white supremacist government at gunpoint. So prominent black citizens and their white allies were forced onto trains and exiled from the city. They was told if they ever came back, they'd be killed. So black property was seized, black businesses were destroyed, and this was known as the only successful coup in the United States. And it worked. No one was prosecuted. No one was held accountable. The new government stayed in power. So in 1900, North Carolina passed a new constitution with literacy tests and poll taxes, and it was designed to disenfranchise black voters. So Wilmington's black population dropped from majority to minority as thousands fled the area. So for over a century, this was called a race riot, as if both sides were equally responsible. But it wasn't a riot. It was a massacre and a coup. And a state commission finally acknowledged this truth in 2006. So you had Colfax in 1873, and then you had Wilmington in 1898. In both times, black political power was destroyed through violence. But massacres weren't just about politics. Sometimes black people were killed simply for organizing, for asking for fair wages, for trying to improve their economic situation. Which brings me to the year of 1919, and it was a year that was called Red Summer. So over 36 race massacres across the country happened. 1919 was one of the bloodiest years for racial violence in American history. So across the country, you're talking about in Chicago, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Charleston, and there were many more. And black soldiers had just returned from World War I, and they fought for democracy abroad. They expected to be treated as citizens at home. But again, white America said no, and one of the worst massacres happened in Elaine, Arkansas. So after slavery ended, most black people in the South became sharecroppers. They rented land from white landholders. They worked the land. At harvest, they were supposed to get a share of the profits. But the system was designed to actually keep them in debt. So the white landholders, they controlled the scales so they could cheat on the weight, right? They kept the books. They could lie about the prices. They ran the company stores, so they were able to charge inflated prices. And they decided what was owed. And of course, it was always more than what was actually earned. And so it was just slavery by another name. So in September 1919, black sharecroppers in Elaine, Arkansas, they organized and they formed what was called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. And what was their goal? To hire a lawyer, to demand fair payment, and to sue if necessary. They weren't violent, they weren't radical, they just wanted to be paid fairly for their labor. And that was enough to get them killed. So on September 30th of 1919, black sharecroppers, they met at a church, Hoop Spur Church, to discuss their plans. And so white men drove up and they shot into the church. So the sharecroppers fired back in self-defense. One white man died in that exchange. And that's when everything broke loose. White mobs formed, like hundreds of men, eventually over 1,000. Federal troops were called in from Camp Pike. For days, white mobs and soldiers hunted black people. They went through fields, through homes, through the woods. They shot black men, women, and children on sight. Bodies were left in ditches and rivers and in the fields. And the exact number that was killed will never be known, of course. Official reports said, I think it was around 100. Historians estimate that it was around 200 to 240 black people that were killed. Some say the number was even higher. So this was legal lynching, using air quotes here. After the massacre, over 200 black people were arrested. None of the white mob members were charged, though. 12 black men were sentenced to death based on confessions extracted through torture. They were beaten, electrocuted, and threatened with lynching until they confessed to inciting a riot. But the NAACP did intervene, and the case went to Supreme Court, and that was Moore v. Dempsey in 1923. But the court ruled that convictions obtained through mob intimidation violated due process. So the men, the black men, were even, the men who killed the black men were freed. No one was ever persecuted, or prosecuted, I should say, for the massacre. Sorry. Having a hard time reading my own notes. I'm sorry. Why it matters. Why does this massacre called the Elaine Massacre, what it showed was that what happened when black people organized for economic justice, even if they weren't demanding anything radical, if it was just, fair play, they were slaughtered for it. And so Elaine, that was in 1919. 2 years later, in 1921, there was another massacre that happened. This one is finally becoming more widely known, but for decades it was covered up. And I'm sure you've heard of it, the destruction of Black Wall Street. So that was the Tulsa Race Massacre. So the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma was one of the most prosperous black communities in America. Black people owned banks, hotels, they owned theaters, restaurants, law firms, medical offices. They even had a black hospital, black newspaper. So there were over 300 black-owned businesses. And so it was called Black Wall Street. And it was proof that when black people had opportunity, they did build wealth. But again, white Tulsa did not like that. So on May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, took an elevator to use a restroom on an upper floor. So Sarah Page, she was a 17-year-old white elevator operator. She was in the elevator when Dick, the 19-year-old, entered the elevator to go to the restroom. So exactly what happened is a bit unclear. I couldn't really find a lot or specifics, but most likely what I was able to read anyways, most likely Roland stumbled and grabbed her arm to probably steady himself. But she screamed and he ran. And the next day, the Tulsa Tribune ran a headline that said, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." But it was a lie. But that lie, of course, it didn't matter that it was a lie. Because by evening, a white mob gathered at the courthouse demanding that the 19-year-old, the black guy, they wanted him to be hanged for, they wanted him to be handed over for lynching. And so black men, many of them, again, World War I veterans, they went to the courthouse to protect the 19-year-old Dick. His name was Dick Rowland. Of course, by this time they'd seen so many lynchings and they just wasn't going to let it happen again. They were armed, they were organized, they were there to prevent a murder. A white man tried to disarm a black veteran at that time and a shot was fired. And at that moment, Tulsa exploded. So from May 31st into June 1st, 1921, white mobs invaded Greenwood. They looted black homes and businesses. They set fires. They shot black people on sight. And then the planes came. Private planes flown by white Tulsans dropped devices on Greenwood. And to my knowledge, that was the first aerial bombing of an American city. So over 35 blocks were destroyed. Over 1,250 homes were burned. 300 businesses were destroyed. Churches, schools, hospitals, they were all burned to the ground. And it is estimated that 300 black people were killed. Men, women, and children. Some were shot in their homes, some were burned alive, some were dragged out and executed in the streets. Over 6,000 black residents were rounded up and held in internment camps. I didn't know this part. And they weren't released until a white person vouched for them. Their neighborhood was basically left in ashes. Insurance companies, they refused to pay out claims. Black families lost everything: homes, businesses, generational wealth. They had to start over with nothing. And then the massacre was erased. It wasn't taught in Oklahoma schools. It wasn't in textbooks. Survivors were silenced. And for 75 years, it was buried. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians began documenting what really happened. In 2001, the Oklahoma Commission released a report acknowledging the massacre. In 2020, mass graves were discovered. In 2021, 100 years later, 3 survivors testified before Congress. I don't know how anybody could read or listen to this without becoming emotional just a little bit. So anyway, there are some people who lived into their hundreds. They were waiting their entire lives for justice, and some are still waiting. So Tulsa was in 1921, and then 2 years later, in 1923, it happened again. Another thriving black community, another false accusation, and another massacre. So, just so for some clarity, because I seem to have put those two together. So Tulsa was them destroying destroying Black Wall Street. That was in 1921. And it started because a black man entered the elevator where a white woman was. Again, I wasn't able to find out many specifics, but it seems like the leading story is that it was believed that maybe the 19-year-old black kid may have lost his balance and he may have grabbed onto her arm to steady himself. But it came out as if he was attacking the girl in the elevator. And so from May 31st into June 1st, 1921, white mobs invaded the area and they looted black homes. And then the planes came and they dropped devices on Greenwood, which basically destroyed everything. Everything went up into ashes. And then there was something called the internment, where over 6,000 black residents they were rounded up and held in internment camps. And they weren't released until a white person vouched for them. And so what happened as a result, insurance companies, so the aftermath of the massacre, insurance companies refused to pay out claims, and so black people lost everything. And this wasn't in any textbooks, and survivors were silenced. And so it wasn't until the 1990s that historians began documenting what really happened. And some people are still waiting for justice. In 2021, 100 years later, 3 survivors testified before Congress. There was Mother Viola Fletcher. She was 107 years old. Mother Leslie Randall, Benningfield Randall, she was 106 years old. And Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, he was 100 years old. So they lived their entire lives waiting for justice. And they're still waiting for it. Even though they've passed, of course, justice has never come. And so that was in Tulsa in 1921. And then 2 years later, in 1923, it happened again in Oklahoma. There was another thriving black community, another false accusation, another massacre. And now let's talk about Rosewood, Florida. So I'm sure some of you heard of the movie called Rosewood. Well, that was based on this massacre that happened in 1923. So Rosewood, Florida was a small, predominantly black town of about 200 people. Black families owned property. They had a school, they had churches, they had a Masonic lodge. So Rosewood was pretty much quiet and peaceful. And then a white woman lied. In January 1st of 1923, Fannie Taylor, a white woman in nearby Sumner, she claimed that she'd been attacked by a black man, but she wasn't. Historians believe she was either covering up an affair or was beaten by her husband or lover, which was, of course, a white man. But she knew that if she said a black man did it, white men would believe her and wouldn't ask any questions. And of course, she was right. So white mobs from surrounding towns, they descended on Rosewood. They were looking for Jesse Hunter, a black man who'd recently escaped from a chain gang. They claimed that he was the attacker. He wasn't even in Rosewood at the time, but that didn't matter. They went door to door. They dragged black men out of their homes. They tortured them for information. So Sam Carter, a black blacksmith, was lynched. He was dragged behind a car. He was mutilated and hung from a tree. And the mob continued hunting. So on January 4th through 7th in 1923, during those time, over those several days, the white mob, they just continued to grow. And they set fire to black homes. They shot at anyone who tried to flee. Black families had to hide in swamps. And then there was a white family called the Wrights. They hid some black residents and they helped them escape, but most had to run with like nothing. So by January 7th, Rosewood, that town was gone. Every black owned home and building was burned to the ground. At least 6 to 8 people were confirmed and killed. Historians believe the actual number was 40 through 150 or higher. So there were bodies that were hidden, burned, and even buried in the swamps. But Rosewood was never rebuilt. The survivors of that massacre, of course, they fled and they scattered to other places, and many never spoke about it. The trauma was just too deep, and they feared white retaliation. So the massacre was buried for about over 60 years. And then finally, in the 1980s, a journalist began investigating. In 1993, the Florida legislature commissioned an official investigation. In 1994, 71 years after the massacre, Florida became the first state to compensate survivors of a racial massacre. And 9 survivors received $150,000 each. A scholarship fund was established for the descendants, and it was the first time a state acknowledged responsibility and paid reparations. But most survivors had already died. So we talked about Colfax, 1873. We talked about Wilmington in 1898. We talked about Elaine in 1919. We talked about Tulsa from 1921, and then Rosewood in 1923. If you think about that, all of these happened between 50 and 150 years ago. And you might think, though, that was then, this doesn't happen anymore. But it does. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Emanuel AME Church in 2015. So on June 17th in 2015, in Charleston, South Carolina, Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest black churches in the South. It was founded in 1816. It was a history of resistance. In 1816, we had Denmark Vesey, a black man who planned a slave rebellion in 1822. He was a member of this church. This church was burned down in retaliation, but it was rebuilt. So for 200 years, it was also known as Mother Emanuel. The church was. For 200 years, it has stood as a symbol of black faith and resilience. But then the Bible study on June 17, 2015, a Wednesday night Bible study, 12 people gathered. And among them was Reverend Clementa Pinckney. He was the pastor and a South Carolina state senator. You had Cynthia Hurd among the people there. She was a librarian. And you had Susie Jackson, who was 87 years old. And they welcomed a young white man who asked to join them. His name was Dylan Roof. And for an hour, they studied the Bible together and they prayed with him. And at the end of the study, Roof pulled out his gun. He said, and I was able to find this quote while I was searching, so I don't know if it's an exact quote, but it is believed that he said, "You rape our women and you're taking over our country and you have to go." And then he opened fire. And it's believed that he reloaded 5 times, and as a result, 9 people were murdered. Clementa Pinckney was 41. Cynthia Hurd was 54. Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45. Tawanza Sanders, 26. Ethel Lance, 70. Susie Jackson, 87. Reverend DePayne Middleton, Doctor, 49. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74. And Myra Thompson, 59. And Roof told the survivors that he left them alive so that they could live to tell the story. And so, of course, Dylan Roof fled, and he was captured the next day in North Carolina. And in his car, police was able to find a manifesto. Roof was a white supremacist. He'd radicalized online. He believed black people were inferior and dangerous. He chose Mother Emanuel specifically because of its historical significance. He wanted to start a race war. 2 days later, at Roof's bond hearing, something happened that shocked everybody. The victim's family offered forgiveness. Nadine Collier, the daughter of Ethel Lance, said, "I forgive you. You took something very precious from me, but I forgive you." And then others began to echo her sentiments. It was a profound act of grace, but it's important to understand forgiveness doesn't mean that there are no consequences. So Roof was convicted of federal hate crimes and sentenced to death. So Emanuel AME shooting proves this violence didn't end in the 1960s. White supremacist terrorism is still happening and is still targeting black people in sacred spaces, like in churches, synagogues, mosques. The family's forgiveness showed the world the depth of black faith. But we also need to acknowledge black people should not have to forgive their way out of oppression. Justice requires accountability, not just grace. And so let's review what we went over here. We have Colfax from 1873. So black political power was destroyed. We have Wilmington of 1898. The black government was overthrown. In Elaine, 1919, the black their organizing was crushed. In 1921, we have the black wealth was burned to the ground. In Rosewood, 1923, an entire black town was erased. And then in Charleston, in 2015, black faith community attacked. And do you see the pattern here? Whenever black people have gained power, political, economic, or social, white supremacy responded with violence, and the legal system seems to protect the perpetrators. And that's not ancient history. That's the foundation that America is still built on. And so there's a connection here that, I kind of wondered if I should mention it. And by me mentioning it doesn't necessarily prove a side that I'm on. Again, I have an attended goal here. And I have to mention it because it was such a defining moment in history. So I need to mention the year 2020. Because what I need you to see is the pattern somewhat continued. And again, I'm not saying which side I'm on. I am giving you information. I'm hoping that you take it and you study it out for yourself. My ultimate goal here, again, is to give you information so that it will drive you to study even more. It's just like I do with my teachings, my biblical teachings. I give you just enough to prick and to encourage further study on your own. And after I end almost every teaching of mine, I tell them to go be a Berean and you study the scriptures to see if it was so. So I'm going to ask you to have that same mindset with all of these things that I've mentioned. And you go out and you read and you study to see if these things were so. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the world watched a black man beg for his life. I can't breathe, he said. He called out for his mama. He said, please. And Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck until he was dead. I know that everybody have their exact opinion of what happened, and you are absolutely right to have an opinion because it's yours. No one can take it from you, just like I have my own opinion. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that what happened as a result. So, that video went viral and protests erupted, and I believe it was all 50 states. Over 26 million people took to the streets. Some people called it the largest civil rights movement in U.S. history. And so I add George Floyd to this because, again, this is progressive. From me starting out with episode 1 until the end of episode 7, I want you to see a progression here. I want you to hear the messages. We're going to talk more about 2020 in the next episode. I just have a few more things to write. I may actually finish that tonight, and I may even record the next one tonight because I only have a little bit more to go to put it together. But what we're seeing is there's violence between some white people, because I am not here to criminalize or to down every white person. White people in and of themselves are not the problem. And if that's the message that you're getting here, you have totally missed it. You have totally missed it. I am not trying to paint white people as the bad guys. In every culture, in every group, there are evil people and there are people who do well. So please don't misinterpret the message. And if you walk away from this hating white people, then I will ask you again to sit with this series and study because your focus is wrong. So ask yourself these questions as I close. Why weren't you taught these things in school? These aren't minor events. These are some of the worst incidents of domestic terrorism in American history. But why were they erased? Why weren't we taught these in school? I know that I wasn't in school. Now, I will say this, me being from up north, I don't know if there's a difference. Because I was up north, maybe they didn't mention it. I'm living in the South now. But I'll have to do some studying to see if it was taught in the schools in the South. But I know I wasn't taught any of these things. And what it made me do this past week, I research some books I wanted to order to further my knowledge, but I wanted to see what's being taught. So I plan to order some books that they use in college to see what they teach. And I still plan to order some books. I have to find which books they're using in some high schools today, because I'm just curious, how is it being taught today? Do we truly narrow it down to Black History Month, and you may hear something, within the Black History Month, they may call out a paragraph or two. This started with Negro History Week, where, we were learning about the accomplishments of Black people. So is that the only thing they're taught in the books, the good side? Once I have these books delivered, I am just curious to see what I find. And I think I'm going to come back and probably add to this series once I actually take the time to see what is being taught out there. And I'm not just saying what are white people teaching or white professors. I want to know what's being taught in predominantly white institutions. And I also want to see what's being taught in the historically Black colleges and universities. Because this is history and it needs to be told regardless of the school you go to, whether it's predominantly white or predominantly Black. Regardless, this is history and it should be taught and it shouldn't be erased. So what does it mean when you hear that no one was held accountable? So not one person was prosecuted for Colfax, not one person for Wilmington, not one person for Elaine or Tulsa or Rosewood. So until there's accountability, there's no justice. Until there's justice, there's no healing. And again, I don't say this to give anyone a victim mentality. No, I'm hoping to motivate you, encourage you. I'm also, I don't get many comments under the videos, and that's fine, but I do have people who have, looked at the rest of some of my other videos where I have an email address, or some people know me from Facebook, and they've reached out to me personally, and I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the feedback that says, thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing it in a way that you're not teaching hate. Because I don't want to teach hate. If I teach hate, that defeats the purpose. But I also, what broke my heart one time is I read somebody who reached out, and I read what they wrote, and they were telling me that they had a fear of doing this. They've wanted to do this for some time, but they had a fear of doing so. So what are we reaping now? I can't help but ask myself. I think of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, because remember in one of the episodes, I talked about how scripture was used to get slaves to believe that what was happening was God's will. And so Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 comes to mind. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Over a century, America has sowed violence, theft, oppression against Black people seeking just their basic rights. So what do you think we're reaping right now in 2026? There's still division. There's still distrust. There's still violence. And you can't help but get this sense that everything is collapsing or about to collapse. This is the harvest. That's why I named this The Reckoning Is Now. And if you don't feel that heaviness, if you don't feel that everything is about to collapse, I don't know. So in the next episode, we're going to trace how the violence that we learned of today, how it was codified into law. So we're going to pick up from 1877, and I'm going to bring us all the way to 2026. So just to give you an idea of some of the things that I have listed here that I want to speak on, it's going to be Jim Crow as America Apartheid. We're going to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson. We're going to talk about lynching as terrorism, convict leasing, the civil rights movement, mass incarceration. I'm going to touch on George Floyd just a little bit more, but not from the angle that you think I am. And we're also going to talk about why Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 2013. 2013. So again, that was, mind you, almost 150 years after the 13th Amendment that they finally ratified it. But anyways, my final thought I'm going to leave with you is that I am not telling you these stories to make you despair. I'm telling you these stories because truth is the first step towards healing. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. And to be quite honest with you, America has not yet acknowledged this. So I want you to remember their names, remember what was done. But then I ask yourself, or I ask you to ask yourself, what am I going to do with this truth? This is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversations. Thank you for listening.